Hi, folks. Welcome to our luncheon. Welcome to the luncheon that we've titled Are Prisons the New Asylums? Inmates with Mental Health Issues and the Role of Segregation. Delighted to see so many of you here today. This is obviously a really important and timely topic, so we're delighted to have you all here. My name is Mike Clare. I'm the Associate Director for Public Policy at the Harris Centre, which is a part of Memorial University. And I'm also delighted, as Michael mentioned earlier, to co-host this event with the Institute for Public Administration of Canada, or IPAC, the Newfoundland Labrador chapter. So it's a great partnership, and we're delighted to be doing this together. I want to recognize Michelle Snow, who is the president of IPAC. Where are you, Michelle? Raise your hand. Oh, she's probably still at the desk registering. So Michelle is here as well. I want to welcome those of you who are with me here in the Suncor Energy Fluvarium in St. John's, as well as those who are watching on the internet. So welcome, everybody. The simplest way to address our social problems is to hide them from public view. Once out of sight, these problems are then out of mind. And then we can all live more happily thereafter. Except, of course, if we're the ones suffering from mental illness, addictions, or even the stresses of living in poverty. Or if we know and love someone in one of these situations. Or if we care about social equity, maximizing social potential, or a well-functioning society. In those cases, we do care about what's happening in prisons. Prisons are a good place to keep people out of sight. They are opaque institutions. The public can't see inside the walls. And once inside the walls, it's easiest to deal with acute social problems, again, by segregating those people with problems from the general prison population. There's no doubt that segregating people is necessary for society's protection and for the protection of those people who are behind bars. But are we going about it the right way? Does Canada overly rely on incarceration to treat social problems? And does our correctional system overly rely on segregation to maintain order within its walls? These are some of the questions we will be addressing in this session. So before we start, I'll quickly outline how this session is going to go. We're going to start with two PowerPoint presentations by our two speakers. That's going to go for about 45 or 50 minutes. And this is going to be followed by a Q&A session with you, the audience. So for those of you who are with me here in the Fluvarium, we're going to circulate a wireless microphone so that the people online can hear your question or your comment. For those of you who are online, there is a text box on your screen. Simply write your question or comment, and one of us is going to read it out for everybody to hear and for the presenters to address. We are going to be archiving the presentation part of this on the Harris Centre's website probably as soon as tomorrow. We're not going to be archiving the Q&A session. Tomorrow you'll be able to review the two presentations that are been presented, but you won't see the questions or the comments afterwards. The two PowerPoint presentations, we'll also distribute the two PowerPoint presentations so that you don't have to take copious notes today. And we're going to finish at 2 p.m. because we all know that you have alternate lives and that you need to go back to them. And so by 2 o'clock, we'll be finished. So the time for Q&A will be between when the presentations end and about 5 minutes to 2. I'll now call upon my co-host to introduce the speakers. Michael Harvey is Assistant Deputy Minister with the Department of Health and Community Services in the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador, and also the Vice President for the Newfoundland and Labrador chapter of IPAC. Over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike. So it's my honor to introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce them both right away and then hand the floor over to them entirely. Speaking to us first will be Dr. Colleen Hanrahan. She has extensive experience in public policy research, analysis, and development. Her doctoral thesis dealt with the topic Assigning Responsibility for Mental Health Services in a Provincial Prison, a Case Study. She's the Managing Director of the Institute for the Advancement of Public Policy Incorporated, a consulting practice based here in St. John's, which she founded in 1998. She has assisted clients in setting policy and program directions in the areas of mental health, the justice system, including correctional facilities, housing, and services in Indigenous communities. Prior to working as a consultant, she was a solicitor in the Department of Justice, Newfoundland and Labrador, She's currently a sessional instructor with the Law and Society program at Memorial University and a sessional lecturer at the School of Social Work. She's a member of the board of directors of the Jimmy Pratt Foundation and is a member of the advocacy committee of the Seniors Resource Center of Newfoundland and Labrador. Our second speaker is Howard Sapers. Mr. Sapers was appointed independent advisor on corrections reform by the Government of Ontario on the 1st of January of this year. Between 2004 and 2016, Mr. Sapers was the Correctional Investigator of Canada. In that capacity, he provided independent oversight of the Correctional Service of Canada and served as an ombudsman for federally sentenced offenders. He has an extensive background in criminology and corrections gained through a combination of education, employment, community, and public service. Prior to his appointment as independent advisor, he held a variety of criminal justice positions, including vice chairperson for the Prairie Region for the Parole Board of Canada, director of the Crime Prevention Investment Fund at the National Crime Prevention Centre, and executive director of the John Howard Society of Alberta. Mr. Sapers has received a variety of forms of national recognition for his work and service. He's been recognized as an outstanding alumni by the Simon Fraser University and was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree by the University of Ottawa in 2016. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and first Dr. Hanrahan to the podium. Thank you.
Okay. Could you let me know if you can't hear me, because I have a real problem projecting my voice. Does everyone hear me back there? Okay, great. Thanks. Well, thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here. I can tell you it's been a very stressful morning. We're moving house, and everything I own is in a box. So I've seen Howard 3 days in a row with the same jacket on. So I do have more clothes. But anyway, so you're taking me as I am. Okay, I wanted to talk about this topic because this is not my issue. This is an issue that came through all the research I've done over the past number of years on my dissertation related to mental health in prisons. And I mean, this is, like I say, I can't take credit for the concept of prison equals asylum, but just let you know, this is the thinking, and certainly there's lots to suggest it might be justified. Okay, so the overview of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how it came that people are referring to prisons as new asylums. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. I am not able to identify the province or the particular prison, but I can tell you it's a provincial prison, and a lot of the issues that were evident in my research are also evident across the other provinces in their prison system. And then my big question, my research question is, who should be in charge of mental health services in a prison? And this took me down lots of little rabbit holes to try to figure out, now, why is it, and just so people, it's the correctional system that is responsible for providing health services to inmates and prisoners. So the question is, how did that ever happen? Because, you don't go to a prison to get health care, and would you expect a prison administrator to be operating your hospitals? So question, how did that happen? Okay, so just to give you a sense of why I pursued this and why I would be interested in this topic, as a consultant, I was asked to do several projects related to our provincial prison system, and that gave me some insight into a lot of the issues that are in the prison, and particularly around healthcare. I've done work in healthcare, I've done work in mental health, and in particular, years ago, I was a member of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board around the time of Mount Cashel cases. And I used to be amazed that we would have applicants showing up with correctional officers in shackles. Not the officers, them. The applicants would be in shackles, and but when you think about it, human development, I mean, that is the basis of it. I mean, our early years define us a lot and what your socioeconomic status is. And I discovered that there's a very strong connection between all of that and the prison system, in the prison system. So I did literature review, of course, and I take things from a legal perspective. So I adopted a human rights lens. So I did what's called a revelatory case study. And I don't think we have any academics. If you need to know about the research design, I'll answer any questions later. And then why this study is of significance from some of my key findings and the implications of that study. Now, it's interesting. The key findings may not be so, impressive, from the academic world. They certainly were interesting, but certainly a lot of people I've discovered are really interested when I mentioned that I did my research in a prison, because I mean, it's like, as Michael said, Claire said, there is no, no people, usually there's no knowledge of what it's like inside. I mean, HMP is a mystery, right? It's those big gray walls. It's, and that's similar to a lot of the prisons that are in Canada. So, okay, so the rising, first of all, despite the, you may hear in the news that, oh yeah, our crime rates are down, the reality is that we have an increasing prison population internationally around the world, 20% increase since the year 2007 to 2013. That's the latest stats I have right now. There's about 10.2 million people in prison internationally, and it's an increase of about 1 million inmates from previous years. So, it is an issue that that many people really, again, don't appreciate. Now, the next question is, so when I follow the trajectory here, the increase of people with mental illness. Now, people are saying, and people tell me that the profile of the inmate population has also changed. So how did this all happen? How is it that we are having such an increase of people with mental illnesses, mental health issues, addictions issues, all winding up in our prison? I mean, there must be some reason why this is happening. And certainly the statistics are showing that it's true in Canada and it's true around the world. So the literature is pretty clear on that. Now, so when I look at then this situation, you've got a situation where we have all these people in a prison. Now, how did that happen? Well, a lot of it is attributed to deinstitutionalization, where in our case in Newfoundland, in 1970s, 1980s, and this happened certainly across Canada, there was a sense that we have good medications now to control mental illness. People should be allowed greater autonomy. And really, the cost, let's face it, the cost of hospitals is pretty expensive. And people should be able to live in the community. So hence the move towards deinstitutionalization. However, there was an assumption that people would naturally, the money that was saved by closing these beds would be transferred to community-based services. And we all know that that's not necessarily the case. And so hence, in the late 1990s, for sure, in Newfoundland, I noticed it, all of a sudden you have this huge homeless population. And we're talking about shelters. I mean, in Newfoundland, St. John's shelters. I mean, this became quite an issue. So we found that prison administrators now, who are responsible for the delivery of healthcare services, are now expected to provide mental health services. So what did they do? Well, they did what many people would do. If they're responsible, you employ nurses and nurse practitioners and doctors, and you have them on staff. Now, in the situation of this prison I studied, the prison administrators said to me, look, we know nothing about operating a healthcare system. Our competence is managing a prison. So what do we know about healthcare? Nothing. Who do the doctors and the nurses report to? A prison administrator who has no background in healthcare. So, you can just see now that it's a real challenge, because this person is trying to manage a complex system. And I mean, let's face it, healthcare is becoming more and more complex. And it is a system that is, has its own culture, its own way of doing things. And of course, it's not always the way things have happened in the prison. So making sure so what has happened in Canada, we have prison administrators who are employing health professionals. Did I move something? I think I did. We have situations now where people are saying, especially the big crisis has been the increase of mental illness and mental health issues and addictions. So a lot of the prisoners are saying, this is not really our area of competence. We need to get out of this and get this to the healthcare system. So Alberta has done that. They were the first ones. Now I think in Nova Scotia, there's an arrangement. In New Brunswick, there is an arrangement between a hospital and a correctional facility. And now BC announced last month, I believe, that they are going to transfer that over to the healthcare system. And I'm happy to say, hopefully our province will do so as well, because the Select Committee, all-party report on mental health recommended that, and I understand all those recommendations are going to be acted upon, hopefully implemented. So we now are among the jurisdictions that are going to be accepting this. So research focus now. I'm just going to run through this quickly, just so you know that this is always based on a human rights lens. So how should mental health services, and my focus was on the best needs, where my focus was. I mean, other people might look at it another way, but when I was trying to answer the question, who should be responsible? Well, it seemed to me that had to be the focus. So the next question is, I viewed it through human rights. Equivalence is an international standard that's been accepted as a right of an inmate to have equivalent health care services as they would receive in the community. Now, that seems obvious, but as I'll show you, it's not so easy to implement. And equivalence, and that should prove to be a bit of a challenge, how to figure that out. So I came up with a model that someone else had used and proposed. Psychiatrists out of the UK have proposed that really we have a UN convention, a covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, and embedded in that is the right to health. And so the right to health should equal equivalence for inmates with mental illnesses and mental health issues. So that is the model of equivalence. And so when we say inmates should have access to health services that are equivalent to those in the community. Okay, again, now, access to, what does that mean? So this group of researchers led by psychiatrists in the UK, using the model, said, okay, available services, obviously, accessible, but they looked at that a bit closer and realized that the definition of accessible, it can mean many things. And it's not only physical accessible, it's got to be accessible so people feel comfortable in going there. They have confidentiality assurances, and that there is a sense that, there's no barrier. And so this is the question, are there barriers? Acceptable, well, that can mean many things, but from the perspective of this particular model, they're looking at acceptable meaning appropriate. They're meaning culturally appropriate, can speak the language. This is a very recent issue around this province. So these are of importance. And the other thing is quality. And the quality standard, of course, is one that shows that people are licensed to practice whatever their profession is in the medical world. Okay, so basically this is who I interviewed. I interviewed prison administrators. I interviewed the healthcare staff inside the prison. I interviewed people in, oh God, no, it's been so long. Who did I interview? Uh, I also interviewed people in the mental health care system, and I also talked to people who are in the community. There are a lot of community-based organizations, of course, that are a very important role in the prison system. So they were interviewed as well. So the one learning I'd have to say that I came away with that really struck me with this particular, I always knew it was important, the setting in which you're operating, but really critically important inside a prison. Because the prison environment is so different than anything you see outside. Even one of the people said to me, who was the correctional officer, said, you have to park your hat outside the door, and there's a whole new set of garb you have. The minute you walk in that door, a switch goes off, and everything's changed. The environment has changed. So a prison system historically has been operating under a hierarchical system, like a command and control. It focuses on security, and that is the job, to keep everyone safe and secure inside the prison, including the healthcare professionals, including their own staff, and including the inmates, of course. They're paramilitary, and I don't know necessarily that is the way it has to be, but right now in APP, the study I did, and many prisons in Canada operate under a paramilitary structure. And at this point, the entry requirements for correctional officers, there's a high school certificate, plus there's a 6 week, I think it's 6 weeks now, might be a bit more, training program to learn how to be expectations of a correctional officer. Now, park that next to people who are in the we'll say healthcare professionals. First of all, your focus is on patient care. So these people are talking about inmates and prisoners. These people are talking about patients. Big difference. Then we're also looking at people who are in a command and control structure versus people who have been trained through healthcare. You're trained to be a member of an interdisciplinary team. I mean, that's just the way the healthcare system operates. And they are licensed professional, which means you have at least one university degree, 2 university or additional training. So there's a huge difference in terms of the kinds of education levels and expectations of your work. So the orientation is different, and it requires a totally different mindset. Now, usually a healthcare provider is working inside a healthcare system or somehow connected with the healthcare system. Inside APP, the prison administration who control everything, hire these people individually, but they don't necessarily have a strong connection with they have some connection, obviously, but your employer is the prison administration. Your employer is not the healthcare system. So you have a connection at APP with the forensic unit, which is the acute care facility where people are transferred if there is a major mental health crisis. And then there's a whole lot of community organizations, and I interviewed 5, John Howard Society and Canadian Mental Health, Pastoral Care, a couple of the other organizations in that particular community that had a strong connection and had running programs inside APP. So as you can see, it's a different kind of a model than someone who's a nurse in a hospital or a physician who's working in a own practice and then has visiting privileges with the hospital. This is entirely different. So it also leads to tensions, and as one of the actually this is quite common. Talk about a common theme. People, no matter who I talked to, kept talking about the push and the pull inside the prison, and like, who's the boss here? Like, who, if there's a real crisis, who is the boss? Who's going to take charge? And in the literature, there's evidence to say that if there is a attention, or if there's something like that, usually it is the prison who will win out. So, for example, there was a research study done in Kingston, Penn, and there was a researcher who actually had been working inside in a healthcare particular unit, and she studied it all and concluded that really it is the prison who gets control. So if there's extra money, for example, when I was at APP, there was extra money available. And of course, the question becomes now, should it go down to improve their training in whatever, or should it go to the healthcare service? Well, you know, I mean, let's face it, the prison knows what the prison needs. The prison does not necessarily think about what the other healthcare services may need. So it is a very important point that there's this tension. Now, the other thing I want to stress is that it's very important that people understand that correctional officers are vital to the mental health services in a prison, or health services period, because they are the ones who have day-to-day contact with inmates. They are the ones who the inmates will go to seek if they need to go and for medical attention. If they need anything, 5 minutes, okay. It is they who are the people who are going to be important. So, I mean, we have to, no matter what the picture might be of correctional officer, they are vitally important to the healthcare services in the prison. Okay, my findings, I'm going to quickly run through this. The organization and delivery of mental health services to best meet the needs of people. And I was looking at mental health, and that's just because you don't want to be doing your dissertation until you're 95. I want it done in a sensible period of time. So really, it came through loud and clear that really it had to come from, it needed health leadership and health administration. And I can tell you, the senior people I spoke with in APP were very strong on that. They felt this is not our area of competence. We do not, you know, this is not where we should be in another direction. And they wanted to see health standards, which are very different than from correctional standards. So in terms of healthcare, it's health standards that are needed. It had to be integrated with the healthcare system so that to facilitate reintegration. So like the Justice Project we have down at HMP, which is working to do that, exactly that, to try to help people make the transfer and get reconnected in the community and stay in the community instead of bouncing back to HMP. And prison administrators, I mean, this is the important point too. There has to be a good relationship with the prison administrators. And this came through in all my research. As well, there was weak to limited information relating to, well, are the health services meeting inmates' needs? And this is not a criticism of the people who are providing the service. This is really a recognition that the prison administration, really, what do they know about the need for a health database? That's not what they're into. So there is no health database. Everything is by paper record in APP. There's an absence of individual health care plans. That was the other big finding. So that made it hard for people when they're going outside. If there's no health care plan inside, to transfer or port out to another and connect with another provider, that would be challenging. And lack of aggregated data to know how many people in this prison have psychosis, how many people here have different kinds of mental illnesses or challenges. So this is very important to manage a healthcare system. You have to understand who your clientele is and what their needs. The need to invest in correctional officers. Now I know this is a big issue and comes up through the literature. It critical because correctional officers have a big role to play in helping inmates, to working with the people in the mental health unit in particular, the people who provide services, to know whether or not someone's taking medication, how they're doing tonight. Are they still talking to the lights? You know, are they able to provide what kind of services that might be needed? Other thing, they're not prepared for the role. Obviously, we're comparing now, as I mentioned, the qualifications. And so there has to be an investment made to improve services. And finally, a need for ongoing education. And as one senior correctional administrator said to me, you know, we really, very little do we receive. In fact, and when we receive something, we get it like once in, you know, in very few years. And it's got to be repeated. It's got to be continuous because the field is moving. I mean, mental health is moving. So, you know, how do we possibly cope? So looking at the comparison of best practices at APP at least, certainly there are multiple assessments. So people, it's not like they're totally ignored. They're not. They receive assessments. They have, oh my God, I got my glasses on, getting old. There are mental health services, but they're limited compared to the population and the demands. The reliance on facilities designed in this particular prison certainly weren't designed for care. They're all over the place. There's no confidentiality. There's not that there's ever much in a prison, but you know, a little opportunity to have a, you know, to share information. There has to be a stronger link between the prison and community-based organizations. And at this particular prison, there was very limited community involvement. And this was, in fact, raised with me by the prison administration. They wanted more people in the community to be involved, but they figured they weren't sexy enough. The police forces were, but they were not. So looking at the right to health framework then, the services exist, resources are limited. Limited understanding of the inmate population because there's no database and you really don't know what's appropriate, what's, you know, if something is accessible or not, what barriers there might be. Appropriate need for further research. And of course, in APP, I'm happy to say, you know, they all have licensed providers, but there's an absence of an overall mental health program and a sense of connection with the larger system. So the limitations on this particular, and this is for the academics in the audience, observation of I did an interdisciplinary committee in the APP, and there was no security personnel. It was all healthcare providers, which, you know, sort of limited the opportunity to see the interplay between the two. A focus group at the forensic unit. It was relatively small attendance, although I will say that gave the opportunity for those who did attend to be very vocal. And let me tell you, I didn't have any airtime at that one. And the significance of the study really is unique application of the right to health framework for the mental health setting. And this is very little in the literature actually about the right to health, but there's more and more, but this is the first time it's been applied that I could find anyway, in a mental health center in a prison. And it affirms that access alone is not enough. Not having, you know, there's more to health services and the right to health than having access to services. It's got to be quality. It's got to be, you know, barrier free, and you have to have okay. And the other thing is, inmates are Canadian residents. Now, I raised this only because, and I think I got one more to go. Okay, I have inmates are Canadian residents, but under the Canada Health Act, they're excluded under the federal legislation because the federal, under our constitution, the federal prison system delivers health services to its inmates. That's by, you know, constitution. Now, in the provincial system, it just so happens that it just sort of was imported from England, and that's the way they did it there, and that's what we continue to do it. But you're not getting the same kind of service. So I wrote a paper on this, actually. I won an award for it. I couldn't believe it. But this this is an issue. So the whole notion that, they should all be part of the healthcare system and accessible to the healthcare system. And they should be covered under universal health care. So right now, the correction system, the justice budget pays for health services inside the prison, whereas really, like the rest of us, why shouldn't it be, covered on the healthcare system? And I'm sure someone from the healthcare system is going to jump on me on that one. Anyway, how equivalence can be achieved? Well, certainly adopting the right to health. The services need to be integrated with our healthcare system, and the prison administration and mental health. They work in collaboration with one another. And that's it. Thank you.
I have 20 minutes. I have about 15 minutes of thank yous to make, and then a 4-hour presentation. So we'll see how that all goes. I'm going to talk fast. Mike, Michael, Colleen, IPAC, Harris Center, Memorial University, thanks for inviting me. I don't spend enough time here, and every time I do, I wonder why I don't come back more often. So it's been terrific, and even the weather's been nice. You can thank me for that. It's always nice when I'm visiting here. I have actually an ambitious presentation to give you this afternoon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what segregation is. I want to make sure we have a common understanding. I'm going to talk a little bit about the particular focus of mental health issues on segregation, and then the work that I'm doing with the province of Ontario right now, dealing with segregation reform. So that's in a nutshell how we're going to spend the rest of the week together. And I'm going to start with a brief history lesson. Segregation is a very old concept, and it actually started off as a progressive reform. The idea behind segregation was that there should be rehabilitation achieved through solitude and penitence. And so what we saw is around just after the American Revolution, we saw that prisons were filling with people. They were horrible places where people were not separated by gender or age. You had families living together. Rapid corruption in jails and prisons around the world, and particularly in North America. Jailers typically weren't always paid, but they received an income from the families of those incarcerated. If people wanted to eat, or if they wanted blankets, or if they wanted coal for the fireplace, they paid a little bit of tribute. There was robbery, there was rape, there was murder inside prisons, and it was largely so. There was a reformation of all of that. What became known as the Pennsylvania system was a prison that was built that looked like this: central control, lots of surveillance, individual and single cells, on a philosophy that crime itself was a moral disease, that prisons should be places of repentance. Crimes were really a result of a spiritual or a moral collapse. And so what we needed to do was have all emphasis on introspection, and so solitude. And that opportunity to be at one with your thoughts was considered to be the way to achieve that. There were some good things that happened during this Reformation. Corporal punishment was largely abolished, so being put in the stocks or whipping. Inmates were separated by the severity of their crime. It was the first risk-managed, individualized casework approach to criminal justice, to corrections, if you want. So there was some a designation of more or less serious offenders and offenses. Most importantly, gender became an issue, and men and women were treated differently. And the families of the accused and the convicted were no longer brought in to be part of the sentence. And so that was seen as positive. And this was happening not just in the United States, but it was happening around the world. And this model, this Pennsylvania model of solitude and penitence was rapidly adopted universally. And over 300 prisons around the world were built based on this model in the 1800s, including Asia, so China, Japan, and Russia, throughout Europe, etc. So this was modern corrections, and it was based on segregation. Now, not everybody was in love with the idea. After visiting one of the Pennsylvania jails in 1842, Dickens is quoted as saying, "I am not persuaded that those who designed this, I am not persuaded that those who designed the system do not know what it is they are doing." Dickens' doubt actually prevailed, and by the mid-teens, 1913, 14, 15, and then just after the war into the 1920s, this system was largely abandoned. So Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, which was the model penitentiary, was abandoned. Now, prisoners began to share cells. There was work. Prisoners were allowed some recreation. Shockingly, prisoners were given decks of cards. So that some of the sense of that morality it began to dissipate a little bit, and that has led to many calls for changes. So changes in who it is that goes into segregation, for what reasons, how long they stay, how do they get out, and what kind of supports and services should be provided while they are segregated. The most comprehensive findings around segregation conclude the following: that the psychological effects of segregation will now considered to include depression, anger, poor impulse control, cognitive disturbances and impairment, perceptual distortions, paranoia, psychosis, and hallucination. Pretty toxic mix. So this was not lost on the people that run the corrections system in Ontario. And there was a particularly troubling case that came to public attention last year. It involved somebody who had been in a segregation cell for 3 years, waiting trial. And in this segregation cell, typically in a segregation cell, you don't have control over your light. So it's never really nighttime. If you're in a segregation cell, you don't get to turn on and off the light. People have to be able to see you, and so the light's always on. Now, some segregation cells have different settings on the lights. You can have a night light setting. You can have a daytime setting. You can have, sometimes there's an in-between setting. Or in some segregation cells, the lights are either on or off, and they have to be on because the correctional officers have to be able to see that there's a living, breathing body in that cell. So if you're in a segregation cell like this young man was in Thunder Bay, where there's no natural light, it's all artificial light, you begin to lose track of the day. Now, one thing you'll notice if you've ever been in a provincial jail or a federal penitentiary, you'll see there's not a lot of clocks and calendars on the wall. People lose track of time very quickly. And if you're in that kind of environment, sometimes you don't know. The only way that you can keep track of the time usually is through meal service. And so if that's not regular, then you're totally disoriented. Anyway, in Ontario, there was a recognition that something more should be done than what was being done to deal with the use of segregation and to deal with the conditions of confinement. And so the government approached me to advise them on a few matters. And I'm happy to say that the first report on segregation was provided to the government of Ontario about a month ago. 60 or more recommendations in that report. It's going to be publicly released within the next couple of weeks. And so I have nothing else that I can say about it. So any questions? It's going to be publicly released in the next couple of weeks, along with a response from the government of Ontario to those recommendations. And I am expecting a very fulsome response. I want to tell you a little bit about what we found. So the first thing is finding segregation is a problem. Segregation a status for an individual who's in custody, or segregation of place? And if it's a place or a status, what difference does it make? And if you're sent into segregation, what does that mean? Still of the correction system to meet its care responsibilities, not just its custody responsibilities, if you're housed in that matter. Segregation is mentioned in the regulations to the Ontario Corrections Act, but it's not mentioned in the Act itself. So we don't even have a legal definition of segregation in Ontario. So, but currently it's considered to be an inmate in which inmates are confined, an area in which inmates are confined. So it's a particular part of the jail, which is very problematic. And we'll get to why that's a problem in a minute. But segregation in Ontario can happen in two ways. It can be administrative segregation. And so that is segregation where somebody is placed into one of these cells that I showed you for up to 23 hours a day, 7 days a week, either for their own protection, for the protection of the institution, for the protection of an investigation, or in Ontario, interestingly, at the request of the inmate. So those are the reasons why you might be in administrative segregation. Now, you could also be in punitive segregation. So segregation as a punishment for something you did inside the jail. So in Ontario, that's called close confinement. Disciplinary seg. So if you break an institutional rule, if you get into a fight, if you steal another inmate's possessions, you may be charged institutionally, and the consequence for that in Ontario was up to 30 days in disciplinary segregation or close confinement. It's now 15 days. It's 15 days here, by the way, as well, for disciplinary seg. But it's the same conditions of confinement, whether you're there for, let's say, your protection or whether you're there punitively. So it's the same cell, same conditions of confinement, same loss of mobility, same loss of privileges, same loss of association. Policy requires that you are visited by healthcare. Policy requires that there be reviews. Policy requires that you be returned to general population as soon as is practical. Policy requires that your services are not unduly restricted by your placement in segregation. This is all policy. And I also believe in the Easter Bunny. Because these are not things that happen typically inside prisons and jails. And this is not just specific to Ontario or Newfoundland and Labrador, but it's just what typically happens in jail. These policies, even policies around fresh air and outdoor exercise, don't get adhered to. People don't get out of segregation anywhere near as easily as they get into segregation. So, Ontario's average custodial population has in fact been decreasing, but the proportion of those being segregated has been rising. So less people going in as terms of new admissions to custody in Ontario, but more of those folks are going into segregation. In fact, the custodial population in Ontario decreased over the past decade by 11%. Segregation counts grew by 24% over the same time frame. On any given day last year, about 575 to 600 people, about 7% of those detained in Ontario correction facilities were in segregation. A decade ago, it was about 5%. Now, I want to pause there for a minute because there's something very fundamental about this. Most of the men and women in custody in provinces and territories are in pretrial custody. Right? They're awaiting trial or the disposition for some other matter. So they're not in custody because they've been sentenced by the courts to a period of time in custody. They are there for the administrative reasons of the justice system to hold them in custody pending the outcome of some proceeding. Another way of saying that is that they're innocent of a crime. We're innocent until proven guilty. In Ontario, somewhere between 60 and 70% of all those incarcerated are pretrial custody. Yet those are the people that make up most of the placements in segregation. And a detention center, a pretrial center, is run at the highest security level. So think about that for just a minute. Somebody who's convicted of a serious crime and sentenced to a federal penitentiary may end up, for all the right reasons, being housed in a minimum security environment with lots of mobility and association, access to programs in the community. Somebody who's accused of a crime, awaiting trial, will end up in the most austere form of custody in the highest security level of it that we have. It seems to me that we've got this a little upside down. We even have something that I find particularly absurd, although I understand there's maybe some reasons for it. Do you know what an intermittent sentence is? Yeah, an intermittent sentence. So the courts will sentence you to custody, but you only have to go to jail on the weekends, and then you go to work or whatever, you go home during the rest of the week. So you're safe to be in the community Monday to Friday. Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, you check into the jail. You get out Sunday afternoon after. And we have people going into jails on those intermittent sentences who end up in segregation cells. And intermittent sentences are usually served in those detention centers because they're really designed for that sort of high, flow through of people coming and going out of jails all the time. So again, you've got this mismatch of what the purpose of incarceration is supposed to be, because the criminal code tells us it should be used with restraint. And you've got people who the courts think are safe to be in the community, and they end up in segregation cells. So that's very interesting. Last year in Ontario, there were over 22,000 individual placements into segregation. That's out of an in-custody daily average count of about 7,900. So over 22,000 individual placements. 1,019 men and women spent more than 30 continuous days in segregation last year. Average length of time inside a seg cell was 12 days. Over 1,300 individuals spent more than 60 days in segregation. The typical length of segregation varies, but we had 5 in Ontario last year serving more than 3 continuous years in those conditions of confinement. So, okay, I have 5 minutes left, and now I'm going to get to the point. So, I told you this was going to be long and tedious. Colleen told us all about healthcare governance issues inside penitentiaries. I'm not going to belabor the point. So I could just say ditto for Ontario. There is some good news. There's been some policy renewal, and we are seeing some changes in how segregation is being used. But in spite of the policy renewal, in spite of the policy changes, which should have resulted in fewer people in seg and lower numbers of those with mental health issues being in seg, this is what we found. We found that in the fall of 2015, when we did a daily snapshot, about 32% of all inmates in segregation had a mental health alert, about a third. 1 year later, that had grown to 45%. So in spite of the policy change, it had actually gone up. On December 10th of 2016, the day that I dived deep into the population, 322 people, or 49% that day, almost half, had a mental health flag on their file, and they were segregated. So having a mental health issue becomes a risk factor for being held in a segregation cell in Ontario. In October, the daily snapshot showed that 28% of the segregated inmates had a suicide risk. A year later, that was up to 40%. On that December 10th snapshot that I was telling you about, 41%, 4 out of 10 of the men and women in segregation had a suicide alert on their file, and they were being managed in those conditions of confinement. So if you were depressed and anxious, isn't that exactly the place where you'd want to be? And if you're a caregiver that has to try to meet the needs of that person who's depressed and anxious and suicidal, isn't that exactly the kind of environment in which you want to practice your clinical approach? The best available data show that over the past year and a half, the number of segregated inmates with mental health and suicide risks has increased. And so we've shared this with the ministry. I'm going to just skip over that. Now, mental health issues, as I say, are a particular concern of the segregated population. About 20% admitted to custody come in with a known suicide risk. And then, as I say, it can be as much as half by the time we look at their placement in segregation. There were 160 attempted suicides recorded in Ontario Corrections last year. There are some populations where this is particularly problematic, and I won't get into the details, but if we look closely at some of the subpopulations, women, Indigenous accused, elderly offenders, these issues are even more profound. Unlike other healthcare settings in correctional facilities, there is a tension between security interests and care interests. We know that frontline staff have to negotiate daily on how they're going to deal with that tension. I can tell you from my experience that security usually wins. I used to say security usually trumps healthcare, and I'm just having trouble saying that these days. Now, the Ministry of Correctional Services in Ontario was very alive to these issues, and the government did announce some further changes in the fall of 2016, and they did provide some new resources, and they are trying to make things different, but the policy didn't come with all of the necessary resources, and it didn't come with all the sort of the guidelines on how to implement. And so the front line are saying, we're not sure what to do with all of this new policy. We don't have the facilities, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the staff, we don't have the access to the professional resources we need. So these are all things that I consider to be a work in progress. And it was also the feedstock for the review that I did and the report that I submitted. So these are the areas, the major thematic areas in which we made recommendations, starting with the correctional law, the legal and policy framework, and going right through to the procedural safeguards for increased transparency, accountability, and oversight. If you're going to deprive somebody's liberty, if you're going to use the ultimate expression of the state's authority to restrict their freedom, their liberty, then there has to be a commensurately strong and robust accountability framework. Those two things just go hand in hand. No, there's a president. Anyway, interesting. The Harvard Law Review, former President Barack Obama wrote an opinion piece, and this was a quote from that opinion piece that was published just as he was leaving the White House. And I was struck by it, so I wanted to share it with you. I have not called for an abolition of segregation. I understand that the appropriate, well-managed, accountable use of restricted housing can be an important and necessary tool in the administration of a person's sentence. But in the absence of safeguards and accountability and resources and training and proper infrastructure, it should not be allowed. So that's really the choice that I think corrections has today, and that is to do it right or not do it at all. And we'll see what happens next. And I know I'm over time, but thanks for indulging me. And again, my thanks again for being invited.
We have, I'd like to call on Emily Thompson to come up and say a thank you to our speakers.
Howard says I should say something. So on behalf of Howard and myself, thank you for the opportunity to present our research.
stole my moment. I was going to ask everyone to clap for you, so that worked out well. Yeah, I'll say it again. Perfect. So hi, my name is Emily Thompson. I'm the new professionals rep on the IPAC Newfoundland and Labrador committee. And just on behalf of IPAC and the Harris Center and all the people here, I just want to thank you again for the great presentations. It really added to an important conversation that we're having in this province on mental health and justice issues. So we have a small token of appreciation for both of you. So here you go.
Thank you.
And we can do the clap again if we'd like. There we go. No worries. So I just wanted to say a short thank you as well, of course, to the Harris Center, and in particular, Taylor Stocks and Jennifer McVeigh for organizing the session, and to Jennifer and John for doing the webcast. So that's great. I'd also just like to take this opportunity to do a pitch for IPAC and our membership. So if you enjoyed today's presentation and you'd be interested in attending more events like these or our networking sessions, I suggest that you check out our website or talk to some of the board members who are here today about ways to get more involved with IPAC. In addition, we have a few more events coming up in the next couple of months that you might be interested in taking part in. On May 11th, we're going to be having a networking social at the Fifth Ticket, and it's a great opportunity to come out and meet with people who are also interested in public administration issues. And then on June 5th, we're going to be having, as part of the National Year of Dialogue for Reconciliation and Renewed Relationships, we're going to be having a spring symposium. And that's going to be focusing on what reconciliation means within this province. And we'll include a series of special guest speakers, including Judy White, the CEO of the Assembly of First Nations. So that's looking to be a really great event. Finally, I just wanted to let you know that, and we wanted to make everyone aware, that IPAC is considering offering the Franklin Covey renowned course, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Speakers. I'm talking about myself now, apparently. Highly effective people to IPAC members in the near future. The training is going to be delivered by a certified 7 Habits trainer, and it's going to focus on critical topics such as productivity, communications, and focus, amongst others. The course format is a 3-day intensive, and assuming interest levels are sufficient, we're going to be offering it to IPAC members at a significantly reduced cost. And this is a great opportunity to take this in over the next month and improve your own effectiveness in the workplace and in day-to-day life. So if you're interested in that, again, check out our website, our social media, or talk to our board members here today. So again, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out and evaluation. There's some blue sheets on your table, so make sure to fill that out. That's really important for future events and how we can improve. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.